and it gets mixed between mom and dad, and then that information through DNA gets passed on to the children. So the proposal then became, okay, so a mutation, most of them are bad. Lots of them are even lethal, but once in a while, some mutation happens that's good for the organism. Maybe this little ant-like creature got a mutation and it got a new enzyme, and now it can digest bark. It can digest wood. It evolved into a termite because of that. Well, that's good. It's got more to eat, right? And so understanding DNA, the theory of evolution no longer was fueled by what we call Darwinism. It was really more neo-Darwinism. So I'll use the terms interchangeably, but we're talking about the newer version that really wasn't accepted until the mid-1900s. Darwin's scientific discovery is basically considered to be the unifying theory of life, explaining not just life, but everything. Okay, so that's our background about Darwin and his theory that has been entrenched in scientific circles for over 150 years. Well, there's obviously a battle going on for the control of people's hearts and minds. It's been going on over the last 150 years between what is called science and religion or faith. However, it's truly a spiritual battle. It's obviously our intellect is involved, but at the root of it, it's a spiritual battle. It is not a battle between science and religion. It's purely a battle between our fallen nature, what we would like to be true, and the demands of a holy creator. Here's a display, I would say, from the Bible of this spiritual battle. 2 Corinthians 4:4 says, the God of this world, who is who? The devil. The God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelieving, that they might not see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. Now this is really interesting because we recognize the spiritual battle here. The enemy blinding a person from recognizing who Christ is and what he did in order to save us. That's part of what the spiritual battle involves. But move down a couple verses in that same passage, and Paul literally brings in this intellectual battle, and it revolves around recognizing who God is and what he did. Verse 6 says, for God who said, light shall shine out of darkness. That's another way of saying what? Genesis 1:3, God said, let there be light, and there was light. God who said, light shall shine out of darkness is the one who is shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. The same one who illuminated nature with light is the one who illuminates our hearts. The thing is, if the devil can blind the human mind to not accept the idea that God created anything, then he's already got the battle won. There's no God, there's no creator, there's no sin. What should I listen to all this stuff in the Bible for? And the theory of evolution has been fuel for the natural mind, the natural heart, to justify a belief that God doesn't exist, or if he does, he's irrelevant. He's not got anything to do with me or I with him. This statement was made by Darwin in 1879 in a letter he wrote. If he had said this even 20 years earlier when he wrote his book, it would have been pretty controversial. But like I mentioned, by the 70s, 1800s now, by the 70s, pretty much the scientific community agreed that evolution was a fact. So Darwin says science doesn't have anything to do with Christ. You go ahead and read your Bible, but stuff in there, if it relates to what we call science, there's nothing in there that you need to worry about. Darwin's mindset is entrenched in the majority of scientists, although that's changing. I don't know about the Christ part, but Darwinism, that's changing. And tragically, their influence is dominant even in the modern evangelical church. This is a quotation. It's the first sentence in this commentary. It's not, commentaries always come and go. But back a generation or so ago, the Expositor's Bible, and the gray hair in here, you heard of the Expositor's Bible? Commentary like this big, multiple volumes. And it was used by preachers and scholars for commentary. So, first commentary is Genesis. Page 1 of this commentary on Genesis is this. If anyone is in search of accurate information regarding the age of the earth, or its relation to the sun, moon, and stars, or regarding the order in which plants and animals have appeared upon it, he has referred to recent textbooks in astronomy, geology, and paleontology. No one for a moment dreams of referring a serious student of these subjects to the Bible as a source of information. I just had a delightful experience this afternoon with 5 homeschool children. And I guess I'm no one. Because what did we do today, kids? We went to the Bible to learn what God says about what He did on creation, and we considered the order that He reveals to us about when what was created. And what was that weird thing about the sun? The sun was created after what? The plants. It was created after the earth. That's what the Bible says. But according to this evangelical that rates this very, very popular commentary, no one would refer a student to the Bible to get any information about these things. Well, obviously, he goes on to say it's not the object of the writers of Scripture to impart, it's not a science textbook, but to say that it's not intended to give us any information about nature, well, I and lots of believers would disagree. In fact, lots of those who don't believe what the Bible says would say, well, yeah, it is. God's putting that stuff in there, or the writers of the Bible are putting that stuff in there to tell us about creation, and it's foolish. Dodds, and I'm not trying to pick on him, I'm just trying to give you an example of where the church is. This is a couple generations ago. I'm going to show you something that may be pretty disturbing in just a moment. He's trying to defend the Bible. He's trying to say, well, it's not that it's full of nonsense, but that's not what they were trying to do. They're just trying to give you a story about where everything came from, but that's not the Bible's intent. All right, well, I do not mean to pick on Wheaton, but let's face it, Wheaton is, a high-profile Christian college, Christian university. And so I submit that they are representative of our modern evangelical church. They claim to be an evangelical school, and I'm not saying they aren't, but they are high-profile. And so I want to show you some things from Wheaton that are very current about what's going on as an example, not to pick on Wheaton, but as an example of where we are as an evangelical group of Christians, frankly, for the most part. I mean, Wheaton represents, we tend to think sort of a conservative chunk of Christianity, right? I mean, it's not don't want to step on toes, but a talk like this does, some liberal Presbyterian seminary somewhere that just basically says the Bible isn't inspired, it's full of errors, but let's study it anyway. Well, the Wheaton Record is a publication by the school, and they published an article back in 2017 where they had done some survey on the beliefs of students as they came into Wheaton on their ideas about creation. The article's title was, evolving thoughts on origins. And information, they collected information from the entry and exit surveys of students. They have a general ed class called Theories of Origins. And it's one of those general ed classes that everybody takes. Just like everybody takes an English class, everybody has to take a math class. Theories of Origins is a gen ed class. And they asked basically questions about what do you believe about creation? What do you believe about Adam and Eve? Before the class and after the class. So let me read a little bit about the study. According to the data collected, the category of recent representative, which says that Adam and Eve were a pair of humans chosen by God out of a larger group of some 6 to 10,000 years ago as image bearers, with a special relationship with God, is fairly popular at the start of the class. So what this idea is that humans were evolving from apes. They're called, Homo sapiens. Everybody's heard of Homo sapiens. So they were evolving, and when they got to the point where they looked like Homo sapiens, you got a whole population of these creatures. And you've got apes over here, and you've got giraffes over there. You've got all the different diversity of life. But there's this one group of apes that have evolved to basically Homo sapien physically. Then what happens? God picks a couple of them, and then we read, in Genesis chapter 2, he breathes into them the breath of life. He picks these two and makes them human, which means what? He puts a spirit into them, and now they have a relationship with God, and they have all the things that make us human. And like I mentioned yesterday, I think I'm going to do a session on the nature of man, the creation of man by God on day 6. So evolution, what the evolutionists propose about evolving from apes to Homo sapiens, that's all in play, that's all true. But God did a special creation, and he picks two, and he makes them human. And he did this 6 to 10,000 years ago. All right, that's the recent representative Adam and Eve idea. About 20 to 25% of the class population that entered this class believed that. About 20 to 25% believed in the recent representative Adam and Eve idea. At the end of the class, the recent representative view is generally the most popular, with about 40% or more saying that they believe that point of view in their exit essays. So it, to give or take, doubles the number of students that accept this view now of who Adam and Eve were, how God created humans. Perhaps the most significant change happens with the students who enter the class saying that they believe in what is traditionally known as a young earth creationist view, which says that Adam and Eve are recent ancestors of all modern humans, especially created by God 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, just new out of the dirt, like the Genesis chapter 2 says. According to survey data, somewhere between 25 and 30% of the students entering the class believe in young earth creationist view. That number drops to less than 10% and sometimes even 0% by the end of the class. Then there's one other view, this ancient representative view. The ancient representative view, which says that Adam and Eve were a pair of early Homo sapiens chosen by God out of a larger group some 100,000 years ago, or earlier as image bearers, early in human history, from whom all modern humans are descended. It's also popular, although not quite as popular as the recent representative. Both the recent and ancient representative points of view increase in popularity over the duration of the class. The trends all show. So what's going on? Well, what they're being taught in the Theories of Origins class is basically telling them that what you're reading there in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 are not to be taken literal. That's not really what happened. They are accepting the standard explanations, especially the ancient representative, the standard, flat-out, pure evolutionary explanation for where humans came from. But then, they're Christians, they're believers to some extent in the supernatural, so they say, then God picked a couple and made them human, put a spirit in them. They believe in eternal life and all of that. But evolution is also just completely baked into the whole thing. All right? How did humans get here? According to the theory of evolution. Well, natural selection. Some of those ape-like creatures that were crawling around in the trees got down on the ground, started walking upright because, they had mutations in their genetic makeup that enabled them to have new abilities, stand upright and whatever. Maybe their brains got a little bigger, and they started using their hands. And then what could they do? Well, they could make tools and go the whole 9 yards. Flat out evolution by natural selection. This is where the teachers that are teaching this class are coming from. In fact, and again, I don't mean to pick on this person, but John Walton, Dr. John Walton, is a professor of Old Testament. So notice he's not even a science professor. He's an Old Testament professor at Wheaton, and he's written a lot of books. He's really well known, widely respected. He's written a number of books with the same title. He keeps revising them, but the main title is The Lost World of Genesis 1. And he's an instructor. He's one of the instructors on this Theories of Origins class. And this is a quotation from him. I think it's most important to put information on the table that either might help solve some of the confusion or might offer different options than just the one narrow belief that maybe people grew up with, like probably most of you in this room grew up with. That idea that, God created Adam and Eve 6,000, 10,000 years ago out of the dust of the ground and out of Adam's rib. Those who claim the Bible refutes science often don't fully understand the science. Some of you may have heard mention this on one of the radio programs because I covered some of these things. But I would submit that John Walton doesn't understand the science. I mean, he really doesn't. Because if he was up on the science, he would begin to find out that, oh, wait a minute, a large portion of the scientific community is denying Darwinism. And so the entire mechanism by which you would get from apes to humans is being denied by the evolutionists themselves. So once again, we see that the more we learn, the more we discover, the more we find out that the Bible had it right. And this idea that the Bible refutes science, that right there tells me that he puts science as the authority, and the Bible needs to measure up. And where it doesn't, the scientists know what they're talking about. And so then we just change the meaning of the Bible. It's a common way to do it, just like Marcus Dodds did and a couple generations earlier. Because this man apparently doesn't understand that, wait a minute, actually, we don't need to accept natural selection at all. It's sort of like on the way out. So the theory of evolution doesn't even have a way to explain how evolution happens. They just believe it. I would say if you don't have any interest in going any further into figuring out, how the diversity of life came about, why not just, without an explanation, go, well, the Bible says this, I believe it. And frankly, that makes a lot more sense than this idea that time and chance could produce the sophistication and complexity of living organisms. It just happened by accident, really? But that is what they're proposing. So again, like I said, I don't mean to pick on Wheaton because this is rampant through the majority, by no means not all of them. There are good schools out there, good Christian schools. I recommend Emmaus Bible College. You're going to get an originalist interpretation of the Bible at that school. I wish we had a science program. But remember, John Walton was in the theology department. Right off the bat, you start changing how to interpret Genesis. Where does that stop? Change the way you interpret prophecy. change the way you interpret salvation. It goes and goes, doesn't it? So even though some of these schools think that they're, being up to date with the scientific program, within the scientific community, doubts about neo-Darwinism are mounting. Here's a statement on a website, and by the way, I printed out right up here. You'll see how tiny the print is. 28 pages of scientists who have signed this statement. We are skeptical of claims for the ability of random mutation and natural selection to account for the complexity of life. Careful examination of the evidence for Darwinian theory should be encouraged. And years ago, this statement drove evolutionists nuts. I mean, they just would fly off the handle. What do you mean? We have to examine Darwinism. It's a fact. We're done examining it. Now, there's a lot of evolutionists that would, agree with that statement. I don't know if they're signing this website. Like I mentioned, I've got 28 pages that I printed off of scientists that have signed that statement. And there were 1,200 of them, a little over 1,200 that signed it. Then there's another very interesting website called Revolution Against Evolution, RAE.org. And on that website, there are even more signatures. And actually, on this particular website, there is a little more description of the person's background, their degree, and so on and so forth. In this particular web page, there are over 3,000 names of trained scientists who are skeptical, and another 1,000 who are not willing to sign it for fear of reprisal. So, I recommend you go on to RAE.org, and it's got a lot of information on there. The Descent from Darwin, that's basically all there is. There's a website, and you click on signatures, and you'll see them. By the way, if there's any PhDs in here that would like to sign, because you would agree with that statement, go on and sign it. These signatures were not saying anything against them, but they weren't college students. These are trained scientists. If you go onto the RAE.org, in their search engine, type in like 3,000 names or something like that, and you'll find the huge list. Here's a picture of a couple of pages of that Descent from Darwin and all the names that are on there. Let me just pull out a couple so that you can see what kind of people are signing this. Here's the director of the Center of Computational Quantum Chemistry, Dr. Henry Schaefer, University of Georgia. Here's Paul Ashby. He has a PhD in chemistry from Harvard University. So these people, and I would put them on a pedestal, but these people aren't people that got their degree from Emmaus, okay? And they're all signing this statement. It goes on and on. Well, I wanted to look into this a little bit more because I was thinking, maybe a lot of these people are engineers, which is all just fine, but in the realm of life science, biology and biochemistry and physiology and stuff like that, life sciences, I wonder how many of these have signed the statement. Because that would be the true test that there really is a shift occurring within evolutionary theory. So I went through that whole group and looked at the schools, their degrees in the schools that they got their degrees from or where they're teaching now. Out of 1,208 signatures on that Descent from Darwin website, 14 of them had their PhDs in genetics, 37 in molecular biology, which is the heart of evolution theory, 67 in biochemistry, and this really did surprise me because biology is like the one that grips the theory of evolution. I mean, you go to a school and try to get a PhD in biology, if they find out you are a creationist, you will not get your PhD in biology. And I've talked with some of the professors and department heads, and their justification is, look, if you believe in creation, you don't believe in Darwinism, that is such a serious flaw in your thinking. We cannot give you the credential of a PhD in this discipline. 74 biology PhDs signed that statement. And then a lot of other life sciences that I just sort of lumped together, microbiology and insect biology. Another 114. So 306 of that 1,200 are life science people. Now you figure, well, where did they get their degrees? They got them from lots and lots of schools, but I just picked a few, and a few from this area, schools that you would know and respect, I would assume. Well, 3 from Harvard, 2 from Yale, 2 from Johns Hopkins, 2 Columbia, 11 from Princeton, 16 Cornell. These are Ivy League schools. 11 MIT, and then my alma mater, 7 from Berkeley, 9 from Stanford, another alma mater, mine, Notre Dame, 4. I would have thought there would have been more from Notre Dame, although there's a lot of pressure there because they don't want people to perceive them as just a religious school. Rutgers, and now here's some that you're familiar with. Clemson, 5, North Carolina State, 4, University of North Carolina, 10, Duke, 5, Georgia, 9. Now the reason I put Iowa State in here is Iowa State is a school that is famous for being militantly anti-creation. And there were 7 there. To give you an example of how anti-creation they are, that evolution. The first scientist to discover an extrasolar system planet. Now that's a pretty big accomplishment in the field of astronomy, wouldn't you say? I mean, he found evidence for another planet not in our solar system, on a star system way out in our galaxy somewhere. One of the most coveted kinds of discoveries early on when they were first finding this, when they were looking, he found one. But he was an intelligent design adherent. They did not give him tenure. Said, nope, you don't belong here. That just boggles my mind. So anyway, that's why I included 7 from Iowa State signed that statement. Oxford, 5, Cambridge. And this is really interesting. The USSR Academy of Sciences, one of them signed it. And the British Museum of Natural History, which, if anybody ever been there? Isn't it like a shrine to Darwin? I mean, somebody on the board of the British Museum of Natural History signed that statement. I wonder if he's still on the board. So, let's think a little bit about why these questions are coming up. Explanations for the origin of life, being evolution. This is a little chart of evolution broken down into 3 stages, okay? The first stage is you've got to start with chemicals. And, carbon dioxide and ammonia and these things get together and start forming building blocks like amino acids and nucleotides and all the different building blocks that make the larger biomolecules like DNA and proteins and carbohydrates and all of that. So the first step is you have to have chemical evolution to start making these building blocks in the puddles of goo on the ancient earth, all right? And then somehow these biomolecules can make themselves and organize themselves so that now you've got systems that will ultimately become a cell. There's a lot of different separate systems within a cell that are necessary to finally get this thing that's alive. And then after that, you've got biological evolution. In other words, the evolution of a living organism, and it grows, it mutates, it gets more complicated, and you get that whole branching tree that we talked about. Basically, Darwin's evolution by natural selection only applies to biological evolution, the third step. Because nature doesn't choose chemicals. What it's choosing is the ability to reproduce one couple more so than the other. so that the population moves in the direction of whatever that organism is able to do better than the rest. So biological or organismal evolution. Here's one of those branching pattern trees again. You've seen these things, starting with a single cell down here at the bottom, an ancestral prokaryote, a single cell. And then this is the idea of all the different stages of evolution until you get all the way up to the top here, where you get animals, fungi, plants, and so forth. What people tend to forget, or many ignore, is that for all these new structures to develop, you have to have instructions in the DNA to make them. Okay, you can't just have a fish fin become a leg with bones and all the nerves and the different tissues that are involved in there. Just you can't get that from the DNA that tells a fish just to grow fins. There's all kinds of genetic information in there that has to have come about through mutation and random chance. They tend to ignore the fact that these genetic instructions must be in place and work within the existing system so that you can get these structural changes in an organism. And that is why now, as we are understanding how complex this information is, this is why lots of scientists, even though they don't believe in creation, are recognizing that natural selection can't do it. What is evolution? It's the gradual process of biological change directed by natural selection. That's the key. Natural selection is this process of nature called survival of the fittest. When Darwin was proposing his examples, he was looking at finch that just had different shaped beaks. You know what the beak is made of? It's made of pretty much the same stuff as your fingernail. And so different shaped beaks, that virtually doesn't take any new information at all in the DNA. That can occur from environmental pressure. And now we've got all kind of evidence to truly demonstrate that. So we call that microevolution, or as a creationist, I would call it the adaptation of the kinds, the original kinds that God made. Now, whether a scientist calls this creature, this bird on the bottom, a new species, and notice they're all I don't even know how to pronounce it, Camerhynchus, and all three of those are Camerhynchus, they call them, but they've got a different species name. They claim that all three of these birds that you're looking at are different species, but they're all the same genus. Okay, so they're very similar, and the scientists recognize that. That's what Darwin was looking at, and he was proposing that nature could select a bird that's on a dry island to need a little, to need a big beak that could break cactus seeds, and another bird on a tropical island with lots of rain and lots of fruit, needed a beak that could eat fruit. So that made a lot of sense. I mean, the logic is powerful. Okay. But you know what? There isn't a single creationist that I know of that would argue with microevolution or adaptation of the kinds. This is part of the magnificent abilities that God created into those kinds so that they could adapt. If things couldn't adapt, everything would have been extinct probably before the flood. Well, the thing is, Darwin then took microevolution and extrapolated it to macroevolution and said, well, a finch could change into different kinds of finches, but let's go back and take some little stem reptile, like a chameleon, and it adapted and changed into snakes, lizards, birds, crocodiles, dinosaurs, plesiosaurs, all these different things. That's macroevolution, all right? Here's a famous chart, and it goes from the fish that's supposed to be our ancestor to man, modern man. And notice they put them all the same. So look at, that makes sense. Look at the bones changing. They're all sort of similar. And so a visual like that is powerful. And it sort of seems to make some sense, yeah. Forgetting about all the stuff down in the molecules that has to be taking place to change the way your lungs work, to change the way your brain works, to do all the things that are different, just, for example, from a fish to that first amphibian. That's the second one in line there. But the real, to me, fascinating assessment of this is they labeled this man's debt to the past in the textbook. So, you see, you owe something to that fish. You owe something to that ancestor from which the chimpanzee and modern man came from. It's sort of funny, but you see, that is the innate sense in the human heart that wherever we come from, we are accountable to them. We owe them something. We all understand that with our parents. Now, sometimes relationships get dashed and there's no sense of that. But generally, you have a debt. You have an accountability to your parents. And everybody down deep inside knows that they are accountable to their Creator. And this is that spiritual battle where, well, now wait a minute, if that Genesis 1:2 stuff is right, then that says God made me and I'm accountable to Him, and I don't like that. Boy, I really like this theory of evolution. That says I came from a fish, and who cares? Our debt to the past. Well, that was macroevolution. The thing is, macroevolution has a big problem. They call them transitional forms or missing links. The missing links are missing. Despite what you read and you hear on the Discovery Channel and all that, those missing links are so few and far between, and they're just little steps. They're nothing like what is needed to really show, for example, that fish going to a lizard, so on and so forth. Here's something that Darwin said, even as he was thinking through this idea of transitional forms. But as by this theory, innumerable transitional forms must have existed, why don't we find them? Embedded in countless numbers in the crust of the earth. So during his lifetime, transitional forms were not being found like they expected to find. To really give a powerful example and proof, or at least evidence, for this change. Well, one of the explanations was, well, maybe, the fossil record is really incomplete. You're not going to find every little transitional form because only fossils get deposited every once in a while. So, you find this fossil, and then you don't find another fossil until 10 million years later. And so it looks like there's a big gap between them. Okay. I mean, that's argument from silence, but okay. What can you say? Well, you can start counting. How well represented are the organisms that are alive today? Are there big gaps in what we find in the fossils compared to the kind of diversity that we see in organisms today? Orders and classification. Orders are a fairly large group. And an example of organisms that are put into different orders, okay? Bats, rabbits, and rodents. They're different. I mean, they all look like furry little rats, basically, but I mean, they're different. Those differences between those three orders are an example of how complete the fossil record is, because in the orders of land vertebrates that live today, which are 43, we have found fossils in 42 of those orders. So we've found bat fossils, we've found rodent fossils, we've found rabbit fossils. Well, no, again, those are pretty big gaps, right? But 98% of them are represented in the fossil record. So let's narrow it down a little bit more. And within the families of the rodent order, so, mice and rats and squirrels, they're all in the rodent order, but they're also in the same family. So they consider them to be much closer. There are 178 families of land vertebrates, excluding the birds, because birds don't get fossilized very often. Can you think why? When they die, a lot of times they fall in the water. By the way, most fossils are formed because they were buried in water and then sediment. Sort of sounds like a flood, doesn't it? Well, birds float, and so then they just decay. So bird fossils are less common than mammal fossils. Anyway, 178 families of land vertebrates, excluding the birds, are counted today. In the fossil record, we find 156 of them. So that's 88% at the level of just the difference between a mouse and a rat, the difference between a mouse and a squirrel. Those are virtually not even what we would call macroevolutionary steps, but we'll give it to them, macroevolutionary steps. Well, all that stuff is in the fossil record, virtually all of it. So the idea that the fossil record doesn't have missing links because it's just really incomplete is not verified by the data. We know the fossil record is complete. Given that, the first, we might say, revolution might be too strong a word. The first major shift in Darwin's theory of natural selection and how it works was amongst the paleontologists, those who study the fossils, because they recognized the major problem that paleontology had, given, as Darwin mentioned it, why aren't we finding, if natural selection is how evolution happens, why aren't we finding all this stuff in the fossil record? So here's a statement by a person that proposed what is called punctuated equilibrium. The known fossil record, this person is a staunch evolutionist. The known fossil record fails to document a single example of phyletic evolution. That's that branching tree thing. A single example of it, accomplishing a major morphological transition, a structural change, like a fin to a limb, like a leg to a wing. And hence, he said the fossil record offers no evidence that the gradualistic model of evolution by natural selection can be valid. Now this was back in the 80s. And again, people don't hear about this much. What do you mean? The fossils don't give us evidence for evolution? Well, the paleontologists know it doesn't, except they came up with this new idea, punctuated equilibrium. And basically, it's just a huge extinction happens and wipes out almost everything. And so the few survivors that are left, some of them mutate dramatically, and some of them have really good mutations. And so what had been a mouse, it just really, really rapidly mutated into a bat. And it's got wings, and it's got sonar, and it's got all this great stuff, you know. And so bats just show up in the fossil record. That's what punctuated equilibrium. Get the wording, equilibrium. Evolution doesn't happen. It's in equilibrium for a long time. And then all of a sudden something happens and boom, there's an exclamation point and a whole lot of evolution occurs. And so now you got all this whole big bunch of new different kinds showing up in the fossil record. Punctuated equilibrium. So that was the first step away from Darwin's natural selection position. If we go back further, and I don't think I'm going to have time for this much, I'll just read a couple of statements to show you how much faith is involved in these theorists' minds. Remember, if we go all the way back to chemical evolution, to get chemical evolution, what we have to have is spontaneous generation has to occur. Thing is, in your biology class, one of the first things you learn is what? Anything alive has to come from something that was alive. But spontaneous generation has to have occurred at some point to get life from somewhere, somehow, and then Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection can kick in and start selecting the better and the better and the better organism, all right? So some kind of, if you're going to leave out a creator, some kind of spontaneous generation has to have happened. And over the years, several proposals have been made by evolutionary scientists to provide at least somewhat reasonable explanations for how life could have arisen from non-life. In other words, how could chemical evolution occur? How could spontaneous generation happen? But it is so implausible, this idea of spontaneous generation, that this scientist, George Wald, a Nobel Prize winner, and his expertise was the origin of life, chemical evolution into living organisms. That was his expertise. He wrote this in one of his books. When it comes to the origin of life, there are only two possibilities: creation and spontaneous generation. There's no third way. Spontaneous generation was disproved. But that leads us to only one other conclusion, that of supernatural creation. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. And I would submit, remember early on, it's not philosophical grounds, it's spiritual grounds. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. Here's a scientist that maybe, if you've had some biology and so forth, you may have heard of this one. This guy, Francis Crick. He was the co-discoverer of the DNA helix, DNA structure, with James Watson. An evolutionist, he also won a Nobel Prize, and he said this: an honest man armed with all the knowledge available to us now. And he said this in 1962, so this is before literally the discipline of molecular biology even came into existence, because we couldn't manipulate DNA and do the things that we can now. So they knew about DNA, but it was sort of a black box. So he says, the knowledge available to us even then could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears to be, at the moment, almost a miracle, hoping that as more discoveries were made, then it would make more sense. You all know what happened. It went in the other direction. The more we discovered, the more ridiculous the idea of chemical evolution becomes, to the point that we are now seeing the evolutionary community abandoning natural selection as an explanation for evolution. He says, it almost seemed like a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have to have been satisfied to get it going. A couple of explanations. This Discover magazine, what came before DNA? Something had to have come before DNA. This particular scientist, Dean Kenyon, proposed that amino acids would just link up together and form a protein. And the proteins are sort of like the main life molecules to do stuff in living organisms. And so he thought that maybe amino acids could link up together and form proteins, and then maybe somehow or other you could get a cell. The thing is, this is 1969. Molecular biology basically was invented. It became a discipline in the mid-70s. As soon as we learned how DNA works, that it requires proteins, and it works with RNA, and it's got this giant machine that includes proteins and RNA all together, and RNA is made by DNA. I mean, the whole thing is just a huge catch-22. He abandoned it. He recognized that, my theory doesn't make any sense. That can't have happened. Yet they continue to use this textbook that proposed that this is how chemical evolution could occur for a decade or more. Even in the colleges, biochemical predestination is how we got life from non-life. He denounced it, became a intelligent design adherent, and I might have even shown a little clip, a little video last time I was here. And he was talking, I'm not sure. Then the next proposal was called the RNA world. The RNA world hypothesis proposes that RNA was the first biomolecule, and from RNA, somehow it evolved into DNA and proteins, and then you get all the molecules that you need for a living cell. I'm not going to go into this a whole lot, other than to say that you will still hear the RNA world proposed as, this is how we explain where chemical evolution came from. So you get chemical evolution, then you got the self-organization, and then you get this first cell. Well, my PhD was in RNA, so I'm not bragging, but I do know more than most people about RNA. And within years, less than 10, of the RNA world becoming a big hit, and papers were being written and everything like crazy, it basically became apparent that there's no way RNA could do what the scientists are requiring RNA to be able to do to ultimately produce DNA and proteins and so on and so forth. So amongst the scientists who really know about RNA and the RNA world hypothesis, the RNA world has been abandoned. So at this point, there is no, here was a really exciting whole book about the RNA world. David Bartello was one of the main researchers. And he researched for 5 to 10 years, and he basically threw up his hands and said, look, this doesn't work. We control everything in the lab. We control the pH, we control the temperature, we make sure everything is sterile. We add the precise ingredients that we need to get this RNA molecule to just maybe do a little bit of what we needed to do. And as soon as it starts growing a little bit, boom, it all just falls apart. It cannot do in a mud puddle somewhere on an ancient Earth what we can't even do with all the control that we have in a laboratory. And the RNA world is, I'm just going to move on over that. Here's an interesting quote by somebody 10 years ago. Professor, a doctor at UNC School of Medicine, University of North Carolina. The RNA world hypothesis is extremely unlikely. That's an understatement. It would take forever. In this paper that he writes, he proposes that peptides and RNA cooperated to develop the genetic code. Well, that's no different than what the RNA world hypothesis says. It's just he's saying, well, smaller pieces of RNA. The study leaves open the question of exactly how those primitive systems manage to replicate themselves, because you got to have replication, for life. Something neither the RNA world hypothesis or his new hypothesis, the peptide RNA world theory, can yet explain. No one has been able to explain any of it. And so I've already pointed this all out, that because of these problems, not just with the fossils, but even more so with the molecular necessities that life requires, more and more scientists are abandoning questioning Darwinism. So I've shown you that already. Read a couple statements from the new literature. The article title is Why 1/3 of Biologists Now Question Darwinism. Have you heard about that? I mean, like I began, this is really kept under wraps. Because, I mean, if the population, if the educated world at large realizes that, wait a minute, the biologists are all questioning Darwinism, they are left with what? No explanation for how evolution happens. So they are literally just hanging on to a belief, a silly belief, like George Wald said. I believe the impossible, because I refuse to believe the supernatural. One of the things that they report in this article is a controversial letter to Nature, which is like the pinnacle of evolutionary publication, Nature Journal. Letter in 2014, so this has been a few years ago, signaled the mounting concern, however slow and cautious, among thoughtful professional biologists other works by atheist authors, like What Darwin Got Wrong and Mind and Cosmos, find fatal flaws in the theory and assert it is almost certainly false. And so the new theories that are being proposed, one is called the third way. So it's not creation. Well, really, I would say it would be intelligent. It's not intelligent design. It's not evolution by natural selection. It's the new third way. They're trying to come up with new ideas. Another one is called EES, Extended Evolutionary Synthesis, I think is the name of it. But this letter that the article is mentioning, that was written to Nature, the letter was called, Does Evolutionary Theory Need a Rethink? And what's amazing is there wasn't a huge uprising from the evolutionary community against the things that this well-known, highly respected scientist, Dr. Leyland, was proposing, saying, hey guys, we've got some issues here, we've got some problems, we need to come up with something different because natural selection isn't working. After publishing in Nature, Leyland received more than 1,000 emails in support from the academic community. This number is huge for a critique of such long-standing accepted theory. In the 5 years since the Nature letter, support has only grown. The leading critics have been intelligent design supporters, well, you would expect that, who are looked down upon by naturalists, but as each group adds to the scientific literature, certain critiques and findings are inevitably bolstering and redirecting the research of the other disciplines. And maybe I'm going a little too far when I say this, but natural selection, evolution by natural selection is on the ropes. So let me mention one more thing. In Evolution News, published last year, not even a year ago, an article, Neo-Darwinism Must Mutate to Survive. That's great, that's clever. Darwinian evolution is a 19th century descriptive concept that itself has evolved. Selection by survival of the fittest was a captivitating idea. Microevolution was biologically, and empirically verified by the discovery of mutations. However, there then comes a major but. There has been limited progress in the modern synthesis, that is Neo-Darwinism. The central focus of this paper is to provide evidence to document that selection based on survival of the fittest is insufficient for other than microevolution. So, here's what they say. It's our perspective that the burden is too great for survival of the fittest to select evolutionary changes that accomplish all evolutionary novelty, new stuff. Thus, evolution lacks a sufficient mechanism for selecting different traits because a process that looks forward is non-random and deterministic or occurs by an unknown biological process is required. And that's not natural selection. Natural selection is supposed to be blind. So, here's some of these new things that are being proposed. The third way, the extended evolutionary synthesis. There's a lot of doubting Darwinism going on. You're not hearing about it, but there truly is. And I think of this passage in Isaiah where it's almost like the Lord is chiding those that would try to come up with some explanation for where everything came from besides Him. He said, I, the Lord, am the maker of all things. Stretching out the heavens by myself. He didn't need dust clouds. He didn't need gravity. He didn't need time. By myself, and spreading out the earth all alone, causing the omens of boasters to fail. I would submit to you that's the boasting, that's the proposals of the evolutionists. Making fools out of diviners, causing wise men to draw back, and turning their knowledge into foolishness. I mean, that's what's going on right now. It happened once back with punctuated equilibrium, and now it's happening with molecular biology. And so, folks, I know that a lot of that was probably maybe a little technical, but if nothing else, I hope that you will be encouraged, because the claims that are out there aren't changing. And in fact, the rhetoric just gets louder and louder that anyone that would deny evolution, you're just stupid, you're uneducated, you're just a religious zealot. But the fact of the matter is, it is on the ropes. And so the faith that you have put into God's Word, if you have, whether it's obviously for salvation or through the science statements, quote unquote, your faith is verified. Your faith is well-founded, and you should be encouraged that, when stuff comes along and the next discovery that proves evolution comes along, we'll just wait for another year, wait for 10 years, whatever. Maybe it'll take 150 years, like with natural selection, and new stuff will be discovered. Isn't that great? How accurate God's Word is. And, how foolish the heart of man can be if he just ignores the Word of God. So thanks for your attention. I know we went over an hour, but if you have some questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them, but anybody that wants to leave, don't feel like, well, oh boy, you got to sit through the Q&A time too. You don't. But if you want to stay, we'll try in the pews first, because when people come up one at a time, then, I've never understood that. When we open up a Q&A, one person asks a question out there, and then 8 of them come up here and want to talk to me up here. I think it's like I told the children, I apparently am scary or something. I won't make fun of you. I'll tell you I don't know, because over half your questions I probably don't know. I've learned to say I don't know. So anyway, let's close in prayer. Ted, would you close in prayer, brother? And then those of you who want to leave, please feel free. And if you want to stay for a short Q&A, we'll do that. Thank you. Well, I mean, they've found all kinds of things that they would propose are a missing link, especially in the arena of human evolution. I mean, they're going to show you all kinds of gradual this and that. The thing is, all you need to do is take a little step back. When you get your nose buried right in the details, then those details may seem to fit. But all you got to do is take one step back, and then you see where things will fall apart. And the creatures that are ape-like, you recognize they're apes. And the creatures that are Homo sapien-like, they're humans. And there's no crossover. So like Lucy, the famous fossil that supposedly proved that this ape-like creature walked on 4 legs, walked on 2 legs. Well, all kinds of research has been done on that now, and obviously the staunch evolutionists hang on to it. But Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis is the scientific name, is an ape, period. And it didn't walk around all the time on its hind legs. It could stand upright, but all of its anatomy is geared for walking like an ape, just like this. It had long arms, and even to the bones in its fingers, they're curved, which means it was a knuckle walker. So what they propose as a transitional form, and it gets presented, and wow, okay. You examine it more closely, and no, it's not a transitional form. These are extinct creatures that were apes, and these were races of humans, Neanderthal, Homo habilis, some of these things. But they're modern. Their brains they're upright walkers. Their brains are large. They're humans, and we've got as much variety in the races that exist today. You go get the skeleton of some Australian Aborigine and compare it with the star basketball player at Purdue. He's 7'4". He's from Sweden, I think. You dig those 2 skeletons up 10 years from now, and you wouldn't call those separate species. You might even call them separate genus. The variety is completely explained without transitional forms. And that's the case for everything. Yeah. The evolutionists are going to, take exception to that, of course. But boy, like that man's debt to the past, be real clever on how you take these skeletons and draw them so it just seems logical. I mean, it's powerful in our mind. Natural selection, that idea is powerful because it makes sense to us. Well, yeah, if because you suddenly the environment changed and there was snow all the time, and in this population of mice, there were brown ones and black ones and spotted ones and white ones. Well, the white ones are going to live because the owls can't see them. And so the whole population becomes white. And you apply that kind of logic to whatever they're proposing. It's powerful. And it seems like, yeah, that'll work. Until you, like I said, what gets ignored is, but what makes all those changes? Where do those changes, the possibilities for those things come from? It comes from the DNA. And the DNA requires massive amounts of information. And those massive amounts of information don't come by corrupting the DNA. You've got to have that stuff all intact. All mutations do is mess it up. Imagine in my computer, I got a virus. Oh, look, I've got a new video game. No, Word just won't work anymore, and that's a very good analogy to the idea that DNA mutating could make new information and make new proteins and new structures.
Even the thumb, like an 8 thumb, they don't find that.
Yeah, that thumb is way down here, where we've got a thumb that can do this. Now, they can sort of do that, but not well, They can't form a really good, firm grip. Unfortunately, a man can, and he uses it for a club to hit his neighbor. What about RNA?
Can you
Explain it. Okay.
Better.
Better. Yeah. Well, I didn't explain it at all, except that it's my favorite biomolecule. If you heard any of my radio programs, I bet you did. RNA is very similar to DNA. It's made up of virtually the same building blocks. They're called nucleotides. They got a cyclical carbon chain, and then there are little groups that hang off of it. The one major difference, there's another minor one, but the one major difference between RNA nucleotides and DNA nucleotides is, do you know what those letters stand for? RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. That carbon chain in DNA nucleotides doesn't have an oxygen on it. RNA does. And that little OH group on every single nucleotide in those great big long chains makes RNA act really different. DNA is pretty rigid. I mean, obviously it's a big long thing, so it can be flexible and everything, but pretty much it's like a big long Twizzler. Remember Twizzlers? Ever eat a licorice Twizzler? It'll bend, but it keeps its shape. RNA, because of that hydroxyl group it's called, it changes the chemical nature of the structure of this big long thing, and it flips around, it opens up, it can take all kinds of different shapes, which is what proteins also do. They take all different kinds of shapes. So RNA is similar to DNA in some ways, and yet it's more flexible. And because of that, the other thing that hydroxyl group does is it makes RNA break down really fast. I mean, it just falls apart. But that's because when you think of life as having purpose, that's because RNA is the recycle molecule. You can't be having your DNA break down all the time. I mean, you need to save that piece of DNA so that when it comes time for your cell to divide, you get your exact copy of DNA replicated, and then one DNA goes into one cell, the other DNA copy goes into this cell. So you've got to keep your DNA intact, but you've got to use your DNA. So what are you going to do? As you use it, you chop it all up. Well, the cell makes little copies of pieces of DNA, the genes, among a whole bunch of other stuff that's a new discovery, and that little copy of the DNA is made of RNA. So the cell can use the information copied from the DNA, but then you know what? That RNA breaks down really fast, and the cell recycles those nucleotides and makes more RNA. So it just keeps recycling. You don't want to do that with your DNA, because everything would mutate and be dead. RNA is used in the cell to make copies of the DNA. That's called message RNA. RNA is used to grab onto amino acids and bring them to the machine called a ribosome that reads the message RNA and makes proteins. And the ribosome itself is made of RNA and a bunch of proteins. So that's the function of RNA, and a little description of how it's different but similar to DNA. The thing is, what we are very recently now discovering is that RNA does a whole bunch of other things too. And what it has done is, as complex as everything is, from what they discovered in the 70s and 80s and stuff, now there is another whole more than another layer upon layer upon layer of complexity with the RNA doing what it does with proteins and with the DNA and everything to turn things on, shut things off, and even control what the next generation is going to look like. So that old idea that the environment had an effect on offspring that was poo-pooed for 100 years. It's DNA and only DNA and mutations. Guess what? That is also getting tossed out too, because we are realizing that RNA gets passed along from the mother's egg. It's not DNA. It gets passed along from the mother's egg and even from the male's sperm. And that RNA then in the new combination, the zygote, affects what the cell starts making, what grows and what doesn't. And so we actually have now all kinds of evidence for non-DNA hereditary characteristics being passed on from one generation to another. These are watershed shifts in our understanding of how life works. And what's really funny about it is right now they'll be saying, oh, here's the new way evolution can occur. You know, we put natural selection aside and we're looking for the third way, or we're looking for the extended evolutionary synthesis, and they'll grab onto this and go, yeah, see, here's the new explanation. But it is a trap for them, because what this does is just complicates everything even more, and yet once again they're saying that this stuff all happened by chance, and it gets even more ridiculous when you start seeing what those different RNAs besides the rRNA, tRNA, and mRNA are doing. And so God is just continuing to just go, look at this. Remember when he said to Job, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell us his evolutionists. How are you going to figure out how RNA does this to make that, to do that? And we're just getting started. I mean, it's beautiful. So do you know a little bit more about RNA now? That oxygen that DNA doesn't have, deoxyribonucleic acid, deoxy-NA, DNA, makes all the difference between it and RNA, which is just ribonucleic acid. It's got that oxygen stuck to a part of it. Yes? Huh. Mm-hmm. Yes, the COVID vaccine. Yes. It appears that there are effects, of course, which they had no idea. That's why they generally have the FDA take 3-4 years to test these kind of things. But the scientific community, how much Pfizer, had influence, I don't know. That's conspiracy stuff, and who knows? I'm not going to say who cares, but the government, the powers that be at large, determine the disease to be so dramatically bad that we need to do whatever we can right now and worry about the side effects later. So that can only be discovered by time. You just got to find out over even maybe generations, what it's doing. But the science behind it was really strong. I mean, it's something that we have wanted to do for decades, but didn't have the money to do it. Well, remember with COVID, we don't care what it costs. Get a vaccine. And so they were able to use a technique that we've known about for a long time, but it was never economically feasible to do it. So they just did it. And it works. But what it also does, we're starting to discover, and for a lot of people, there seems to have been no effect. But for many, there's all these side effects. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll start finding out, because there'll be plenty of women that took the vaccine that are, have children. I mean, we're talking 2-3 years now. And believe me, they are studying this, big time to determine, what effects. Let's hope that it doesn't have any effect on the progeny, that it was more just a physiological system kind of a thing, those ladies that had some effects. And frankly, it's been well documented that there was effect on the big, strong young men. It tended to cause inflammation in the pericardium. And some guys, a way higher percentage. I mean, it's not like everybody's dropping dead, but the percentage of guys that happening to was minuscule. And it jumped up a lot of guys just dropping dead. And they traced it back to the inflammation in the pericardium, and they know that vaccine causes inflammation in that area. So that's really sad. Especially when those guys, so much of it, go ahead and get COVID. I mean, you're strong, you're fine, you're not at risk, Get the flu. We all get the flu. But the flu is deadly, for some people. Yes, sir.
Did you get any vaccines?
I did. Yeah, I got the vaccine, and I got Karen and I both got the vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, the mRNA vaccine. You see, what that's doing, what the vaccine is doing is it's taking a shortcut. Normally your body gets the antigen, the germ, and it makes an antibody to it. Well, part of the process of making the antibody is to make that messenger RNA. It's a copy of the DNA that will make the antibody. Well, instead of waiting for the antibodies and the immune system to work, they just throw that message in there, right into the cell. The ribosomes make the protein. And then your body makes the antibody to it, and you're immune. So, yes, I thought the science was sound, and part of the science is very sound. Like I said, we've been wanting to do this for a long time, because it's such a great way to make a vaccine. It's so simple. You can do it so quick. Within days of that Chinese scientist that was never heard from again. It was a Chinese scientist in Wuhan. What was the name of Wuhan. It was a Chinese scientist at the lab in Wuhan that leaked the chemical structure of the crown protein out. And he took his life into his hands by doing that. But he recognized the importance of it. And some lab in Australia got it. How they found it, they got it. Maybe he emailed it to him or whatever. Within 4 days. Now this is chilling. Within 4 days of them getting that, they were able to make the DNA with the information to make the RNA, and boom, they've got the crown protein in the lab right then. And they did a little testing on it and so forth to see if it would work and whatever. But imagine being able to make vaccines. If there wasn't any side effects, if there wasn't anything wrong with some of the issues, but we didn't even then understand how complex things are. Imagine how great that would be. You could to have vaccines that quickly. Anybody that's in real danger, you can just make a vaccine for them within, not days, but within weeks. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and it relates to what I was telling Autumn about the RNA structure. Okay, now this, bear with me here. Remember I said RNA is different from DNA because it's real flexible. I mean, it's not just this rigid thing that's the same on the outside all the time. It's the same on the inside, generally, but it wraps up and it becomes like a ball of twine or whatever. And if you mutate one nucleotide inside that RNA, and RNA mutates very easily, you mutate one nucleotide in that RNA, it changes its shape. And now, the antibody looks at that and goes, I don't know what that is. Because the antibodies are looking at the shape of a germ, an antigen. It's looking at the charges and where they are on the outside and whatever. And so one little mutation doesn't change that virus at all. I mean, the virus is still virulent, but what the antibody sees is completely different. It doesn't recognize it anymore. And so the reason that people get a vaccine and they don't get sick for all, and then they get COVID anyway, is because, well, another variant of that very mutatable virus comes along and it presents a different shape. It's still the same nasty bug, but it isn't recognized by the antibodies that your body made because it got the information to make an antibody that sees this virus. Does that make sense? So that's why, why do we have to have an influenza, a flu virus, a flu vaccine every year? It's the same, generally, it's the same virus. But it mutated, changed its shape, and now your antibodies don't recognize it. So you get that one. And you get the same old flu. So the reason some people are getting COVID even though they got the vaccine is the COVID... I just spaced out the name of the virus itself, honey. Remember? It's not COVID-19, is it? It's a SARS virus. Well, anyway, it mutated, and it's out there running around, and their body comes into contact with that one, and they don't have the antibody for that one, and they get sick. Yeah. It doesn't, and it doesn't happen because, this is another really good question, it doesn't happen because when your body comes into contact with a germ, we'll just use the word germ for everything, Your body comes into contact with a germ, it doesn't just make one antibody. It makes antibodies that recognize all kinds of different places on that germ. So you might have 8 different antibodies, all recognizing the polio virus. Okay? So if the polio mutates a little bit, your body's still got plenty of recognition sites, they're called. It still recognizes plenty of it, and your body produces the antibodies and gets rid of it. But when we're being so specific with just this one messenger RNA that makes just one particular variant of protein, well, then your body just makes one antibody to it. And so when it changes, now you don't have a repertoire of antibodies against that. It could be that might be related. Yeah. Oh yeah. All of these viruses, if you ever notice, all of these viruses that we can't cure, all these viruses that give us so much trouble, not all, but almost all of them are RNA viruses. RNA viruses. And that's because when we get an RNA virus, the next year it can mutate and our body won't recognize it now. And so what has to happen is the RNA gets in the cell, then there's an enzyme that turns it into a piece of DNA, and then lots of RNA gets made off of that DNA copy, and then it goes and the ribosomes make a whole bunch of that protein and so on and so forth. So the stuff is mutating all the time. The common cold, RNA virus. Influenza, RNA virus. AIDS, RNA virus. COVID, RNA virus. they're nasty because they mutate. They change their shape, and our body doesn't recognize it anymore. Mm-hmm. But RNA is so cool. I mean, it does so many things. It does so many things. It is this magical molecule, you know. And like I said, we're discovering now some of the things that RNA molecules are doing to totally control. When you think about it, how in the world does a cell, once the sperm fertilizes the egg, how in the world, just because it's dividing, do then some of those cells start becoming proto-muscle cells? I mean, all the proteins, all the structure, all this stuff has got to be changing. And the stuff that was in there to begin with, we got to get rid of that. And then some of these start becoming neuron tissue. And some of this starts becoming bone tissue. How all these proteins, how do you turn this on, turn that off? How do you stop from growing? How do you stop these cells dividing? You know, that's what cancers basically are, is your cell goes haywire and it doesn't know when to quit. And it just keeps multiplying this cell over and over and over again. And you get a tumor, or worse, you get this tissue that doesn't know what it is, and it starts floating around in your body, depositing itself and growing here and growing there. So all of this stuff has to be controlled on so many levels and at different stages of development. And the body does all this, and we totally take it for granted. If my heart stops beating for a minute, I'm going to be upset. Really, what's amazing is that it's beating. I mean, what's going on? The blood flow, the oxygen, the nervous firing, the muscles doing what they do, it's mind-boggling. And there had to be in your body instructions to make all those different chemicals and all those different tissues, and they work together with all the rest of the stuff. And to think, that these scientists, some of them, these evolutionists, I mean, they know all this stuff, and they know it a lot better than I do. And yet they are willing to go, well, I think this stuff happened by random mutation. That shows the blindness that we read about in 2 Corinthians. Wow, I really appreciate your questions, and I really like the way these are. One is sort of relating to the other, so we get hopefully an expanded explanation, and you really can come out of here with really understanding some of how some of this stuff works. Yeah. So, yes. Well, I'm a scientist now, and I've done some of that work, so I'm not going to say every time we do something. Aren't you glad science figured out how to make an airplane stay in the air? See, I'll answer your question, but let me make a point here. I am not trying to paint science with too broad a brush. I am talking about the area of science that deals with origins, because frankly, that is outside the realm of real science. That's not science. You can't repeat it. And yet, so much is focused on that. So, science is a good thing, but it can go sideways. It can even go backwards and cause a lot of problems sometimes. And scientists can have bad agendas. But, yes, what you're talking about is when people ignore God, when people deny God, well, what happens? Sometimes it's the cart before the horse, but, they immediately start engaging in more sinful activity. And sinful activity isn't just a spiritual killer, it is a physical killer. The stuff that people do in sin ruins their bodies to a greater extent than, they already get ruined just with time and use. So, yes, Romans 1, God talks about they receive in their bodies the due penalty for their sin. The more sinful activity you're involved in, the more likely you are to be damaged physically. and certainly mentally. Yep. That's just the way God made it. And yet people don't care. Uh-huh. Yes. Right. Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, more and more scientists, I mean, really large numbers of them for the last several decades, have recognized that you can't have chemical evolution, ultimately single-cell life, evolve on the Earth. I mean, after all, the Earth is only 4 billion years old, and that's not enough time if they're trying to do, a probability stuff. And so where do you go? If you don't have creation, no supernatural creator, you don't have life, it couldn't have evolved on Earth, well, what's the next? Life came from outer space. So this isn't considered to be wacky and goofy. I mean, this is a viable and becoming much more commonly held proposal by the evolutionists that life didn't evolve on Earth, life came to Earth and then evolved. Yeah, so that's why NASA is looking for water everywhere they go. They're looking for water because, well, then maybe life evolved on that planet out on some other galaxy, And actually, they can't really observe planets on other galaxies, on a star system that's on the other edge of the Milky Way. And the life evolved there, and they had a lot more time for the chemical evolution to occur, and then they came on a comet or something, and we got life planted on Earth. Or what really is wacky, but people believe this too, is you've got super intelligent aliens that brought different organisms to Earth, and they're coming back and checking. I mean, that's all in the science fiction movies, isn't it? Right? And this puts that kind of thing, and it helps people sort of like, oh, well, yeah, maybe that's what had happened. They sort of forget the science fiction part of it. But yeah, I like science fiction as much as the next person, but you got to be careful how it can influence your thinking on what could happen and stuff like that. So. Well, it's almost 9 o'clock. Wow, we've been here for, is that right? Yeah, almost 9 o'clock. We've been here for a couple hours. Well, really, I've enjoyed it. I hope you have. Since I told you could leave, I'm assuming that you were sitting here enjoying it to some extent. And hope you've learned a few things. Yeah. Well, I thought I knew, but I had to change a couple of things with tonight's session. So it's going to be in the realm of biochemistry, and I might explain a little bit more what we talked about tonight, the kinds of chemistry involved in building biomolecules and building organisms and so forth. Okay, so I have a lecture called Evolution, Creation, and Intelligent Design, and I talk about the differences because they are very different. So a little bit of it might repeat this, but it probably won't hurt to have a little review anyway, and try to educate you on when you hear somebody talking about intelligent design, or you hear evolutionists say, "Oh, intelligent design, that's just creation." Well, that's far, far from the truth. Creation is very different from intelligent design, although creation certainly has an intelligent designer that's involved, and then of course there's evolution. So I'm going to talk about probably some of that kind of stuff tomorrow. Okay? All right. Or I might do something completely different. I don't And that's not my computer. Okay.